So thank you very much for inviting me. I love to come to Australia and really pleased to be here. And the focus is on this issue of what kind of measurement do we need to make. And I know that the Partnership Center is really thinking hard about these things. And so let me give you some ideas about how to think about it a little bit differently potentially than you do. So this is where I start virtually every talk I give, with this picture. How many people know what this picture is? Yeah, there'd be a few in the audience that know this is the Foresight obesity system map. And I always say, well, I'm glad you can't read it because I just put whatever label on it I want to talk about a complex system. But the point is, I want to start where we're acknowledging that the problems that we're talking about are complex. That's actually the fundamental thing that I want to start with. And then talk about what that means for how you think about solutions. We did a little bit of work a few years ago where we kind of zoomed out on that map, and this is just to illustrate that there actually are sort of zones in this map. There's food production and food consumption and physical activity, all the things that you would be familiar with that are relevant to chronic disease prevention. And I'll come back to this map later, but I just want to point out one interesting feature of the map. So the arrows on this map are the thickness of the arrows are dependent on how many underlying relationships are in the more complex map. And there's kind of an interesting observation if you look at it. There's the biggest, thickest arrow, which means the most things that they articulated in the original map go from food production to food consumption. And you'll notice there's no return arrows. So the people who constructed this map didn't believe that food consumption had any impact on food production. But anybody who works in the food industry would be happy to counter that. And I think that's an important issue. But for the moment, this is just to illustrate that there are many different subsystems that are part of a big complex system. And each of these subsystems in and of itself is fairly complex. So if this is the starting place, the picture is actually kind of important. I made the point that the interdependencies are really illustrated and the actual variables aren't very dominant in this picture. So let's contrast it with a visual of the US healthcare system. Now this is political, it was done by the Republicans, so I don't know whether there's any validity to it. But there's a really important difference in this picture from the previous picture. This one, the nodes are actually quite dominant. There's a big center circle, which is, the Health and Human Services, and all the lines are quite orderly, and they follow sort of linear paths. So I would argue that the difference in these two pictures is actually quite important. They're different heuristics. They're both complex systems, but the one of the US healthcare system is trying to make you think it's just complicated and not complex. Whereas you get the feeling of complexity from the Foresight map. You get complicated from the US system map. And I think that distinction is actually quite important. So what are some of the characteristics of complex systems and how do they differ from simple or complicated systems? Well, things like heterogeneity of the actors and the organizations in the system. We often talk about, I'm going to talk tomorrow night about the food industry, and we talk about big food like it's a single entity, but there are many different companies and many different players as part of it. The linearity, we've just illustrated how a heuristic like that can give you a different feeling between whether there's linear relationships between actors or organizations or nonlinear relationships. And yeah, I get they're just pictures, but it conveys a different message. There's lots of random behavior in complex systems, whereas things are more deterministic and linear in simple or complicated systems. And you can go through the list, the interdependencies, things like that. So if we start with the notion that it's complex, we don't actually have a lot of data that characterizes these different aspects, and that might be one form of data that we need to be thinking about is empirical data that helps us understand the nature of the complexity. We rarely do that, but we're going to start with that complexity as the starting point. So what are the common responses to complex problems? Well, you're familiar with them: retreat, despair, believing the problem's beyond hope, assigning blame. We do that all the time in the media. Simple solutions, and occasionally we'll galvanize our collective efforts and invest significant resources. But we often don't know how to invest them in a way which would be appropriate for a complex problem. So, I go through these kind of emotions on a daily basis sometimes when I'm dealing with complex problems, but you can see, and we play them out in the media, we make simple solutions, we talk about things in a very black and white way, but they're not that. Instead, there's a whole host of things that are appropriate when a problem is complex. And this is a list I've been collecting up over the years from many system thinkers that I read and I'm interested in. And we're actually going to go through this list in sort of in groupings and just think about each of these ideas, because I think they're where my argument about attribution moving to adaptation really relies. So if you take it that the problem's complex, these are the kinds of solutions that you need for a complex problem, then it speaks to a very different kind of science and research that we actually need. So let's start with the first two, which are usually the most challenging for especially researchers. The point here is that a reductionist paradigm, working out what all the causes are, what all those nodes are and how they relate and cause obesity, is actually not very helpful. And why would that be? Well, because to work them out, you have to constrain things, control things. It's not, you work them out in a situation which is not the real world. And then you think, if I work out that A leads to B leads to C, if I change A, then I'm going to be able to change B and C. And fundamentally, in the real world, when you go to do that, there's all those other interdependencies and adaptations that will take over. And there may be no relationship between what you found out through your research, your reductionist approach, and what actually happens in the real world. And you can spend tons of money and tons of time trying to work that out, and in the end, it's actually not all that helpful when it comes to solutions. And this is where the notion of moving away from attribution, which comes from a reductionist paradigm, to adaptation, which is really more about recognizing the system's complex, interdependent, and we need an integrated solution. If we can figure out how in real time, with the things that we're doing anyways, we can improve and advance and get better outcomes, we would be in a better shape. So attribution, in a sense, is the cornerstone of evidence-based medicine. And I do love Google, I have to say. Back 20 years ago, it was much harder to put together a talk and quickly because you couldn't find what you needed. And I will admit I've gotten lazy about not always attributing where I got the picture from. But I liked this one a lot because, as Sonia said, I started life as a basic scientist. And in this picture, basic science is even below expert opinion. So I guess I wasn't doing anything terribly important back in those days. But fundamentally, the important point here is that attribution comes from the knowledge or the assumption that there's one common truth or some generalizable knowledge that we can then apply broadly across the board. But we all know that that's probably not the case, especially when you have a lot of heterogeneity in either the actors, the organizations that are involved. So I think attribution is really hard to move away from because it is the cornerstone of what we refer to as evidence-based medicine, and we all want to have evidence-based solutions, but that may be part of our problem. I recently gave a talk about the difference between research, quality improvement, and evaluation. I've been asking the question, what's the difference between research and evaluation since about 2001? And the range of answers I've gotten have been fascinating, to say the least, including research is what you do when you plan ahead, evaluation is what you do after the fact. And if there's evaluators in the audience, it didn't come from me. I apologize. I find that a rather arrogant statement. But here's a few things that you can find on the web about the differences between research, quality improvement, and evaluation. And I think there's some important issues here because it speaks to the fact that research is generalizable. It's how you get generalizable knowledge, whereas quality improvement and evaluation are more specific to a client, for example. And I'm not sure generalizable knowledge is going to get us very far in a world that's very complex. I liked the fact that research may not benefit the participants. It'll potentially benefit a population later on. And the business about extraneous variables is kind of interesting because in research, we try to control them, which is what makes research less valuable to real world change and complex change. In quality improvement, we acknowledge them, but we don't do anything about it, and try not to interfere. And then in evaluation, we try to get a bunch of different lines of evidence so we can sort of understand how extraneous variables to the ones we're most interested in affect the outcome. Well, I think we need to kind of mush those things together, if you will, and start to think about how in the real world we can understand how context matters, because it does matter, and we know if we want to take something and scale it up and spread it, the context in which you spread an intervention actually does matter. So I think this is an important distinction, and again, you can sort of see why I want to get away from attribution and control and move towards real-world understanding of context and things like that. I was just going to make the comment about length of time. So research takes a long time. This was actually written by an evaluator, I have to say, so there's a few stereotypes in here, but it is fairly true. Quality improvement is quickly and done in cycles, and evaluation depends on the size of the program. But we need to speed things up from a research point of view, or we're not going to be able to do things in the way and in the time frames that the kinds of changes we want to see happen. So again, when I look at this, it tells me that research may in fact be irrelevant if we stick and adhere to these kinds of things. So I think there's some new paradigms ahead, and this is to articulate why I think if we stick with those kinds of definitions and we don't start to blur those lines a little bit, and we don't start to move towards adaptation, we're just going to get run over. The first is that complexity is growing. So since the beginning of time, our world has become more complex. Now, what are the labels on that? Well, when we were hunter-gatherers, things were relatively simple. There were a few things that we needed to worry about. Where was the food? And let's not be somebody else's food. But over time, our world has changed and become more complex. And what's important about that is that the control structures that worked back when we were hunter-gatherers are no longer going to help us as we move into a world that just is going to become increasingly complex. So control structures of a hierarchy where there was kind of one leader and a group around them worked well for hunter-gatherers. And as we became more complex and moved into the Industrial Revolution, the structures started to become a little bit more complex, but there's still a hierarchy. But when you get to a world as complex as the one that we live in now, you need a control structure, and you need to recognize that a hierarchy isn't necessarily going to get you where you need to go. And you need to understand how you can build a control structure in a networked, if you will, or complex environment. Another thing that's changing is this, at least in Canada, I haven't talked to you guys about this yet since I've been here, but patient-centered, patient-oriented research, patient-centered care is a really dominant paradigm right now in Canada. We need to recognize that individuals matter, and that we need to design our care pathways and care systems around either individuals or groups of individuals. So this is, again, an argument against generalizable knowledge. We don't need to know the one common truth. We need to know the half dozen or dozen truths that apply to the population that we're talking about. We may not need to go as far as knowing the truth for each individual, which might be different, but there probably are groups of individuals that matter. Digital health landscape and all the things that are coming down, including electronic medical records, quantifiable self, even gaming as a technique for helping people think about health promotion and disease prevention, all kinds of different things. And this is an industry that's growing extremely rapidly, extremely rapidly. So the growth in venture capital invested in digital health has skyrocketed even in the first 6 months of 2014. So change is coming, whether we like it or not. And I really think research and the research paradigm has to adapt to the changing world, to the increased complexity, the need for for understanding heterogeneity and understanding how to do this. And I think this is, again, where moving out of that paradigm of attribution and moving to adaptation is important. So that's the first couple of points. Now, what about individuals? So it may be counterintuitive when the system is really complex that individuals actually matter, and they matter a lot. And what's important is that we support them and we match an individual's capacity to the complexity of their tasks. So think about that big messy diagram. When you look at it, you think, well, why would individuals matter? But think about the control structure here needs to be distributed. And so we need to think about how the individuals, if this was a group or a network, for example, then the individuals at each of these nodes are part of how you enable the system to function well. If you support those individuals to do the decision making that they need to do, then the system will function in the direction you want it to function and function well. And what's important is that each individual's task matches their capacity. So I'm talking not only about the individual who might need to address body weight or do change behavior for chronic disease prevention, but even the CEO of a food company. We need to think about the fact that if my capacity to act on the world around me and to manage my particular environment is lower than the complexity of the environment I live in, well, intuitively, I'm going to fail, right? But if I have the capacity to make decisions and have some autonomy within the complexity of the world that I live in, and I've got that good match, then I'm more likely to succeed. So this would be a theory that comes out of complex systems thinking. I don't know that we have any data to meet this, but this is when I say we need different kinds of data. We need to think about these kinds of relationships and think about interventions that actually focus on this, I'll call it simple idea. I won't call it a simple solution because I'm not so sure it's such a simple solution, but a simple idea that if we focus on matching capacity and complexity, we might actually make significant change. Then there's a group of solutions around goal setting, assessing effectiveness of goals. And here's where I think different kinds of data collection may be important. And I think the idea of a shared measurement platform is important. So first, let's think about targets versus, so outcomes versus intermediate or process steps, goals versus functions, okay? So if you think of a simple feedback loop as illustrated here, the thing about setting targets like we're going to reduce the amount of childhood obesity by 5% by such and such a year is, A, it's fictitious if you come up with a number. It's sort of arbitrary. And then you wait a long time and find out whether you reached your goal. And if you reached it, you don't know why you reached your goal. And if you don't reach it, you don't know why you didn't reach the goal. And it takes too long to actually figure that out. Whereas if you had process goals and you were thinking about the things that you were changing in order to change childhood obesity targets, you'd be measuring it more in real time, it would be quicker feedback, and you'd understand if you didn't meet your goal of having 100% health promoting schools, you know, where you need to focus your attention on the attributes that enable you to do that. So again, this is again a theoretical point, but an important one that we really need to think about functional goals and not targets. Accountability, attribution really likes targets, outcome goals. And I'm not suggesting we don't measure outcomes, but I think we also need to measure the other things. This comes from Penny Haw, who's tried to think, how do we change randomized control trials to recognize that we really need to look at function over form. So this is just an illustration from one of her papers about normally, you know, the principle of an intervention might be something like to educate patients about obesity. If you do it by form, then all sites get the same material, and if some sites work and some sites don't, you know, you don't quite know what to do with that, right? Because, well, the material worked in this site where we pilot tested it, and now that we roll it out, it's not working in this site. But what if the functional goal is to have all sites distribute information that's tailored to the local environment? Then you're allowing the individuals in the local environment to use their tacit knowledge about that environment. And so your randomized control trial is around that process or that function of distribution tailored to local literacy and things like that. And you're thinking about the processes of tailoring and stuff like that, as opposed to what's the pamphlet got in it and why did it work here and not over here. So again, it's a different way of thinking about these things. And I would also argue, and this comes out of sort of advances in evaluation, that we need to think about different kinds of measurement. A former Minister of Health in Canada, Monique Béjean, famously said, Canada is a country of pilot projects. And you'd probably say that, I'm guessing, about Australia too. It's a very common sort of notion. Now, why are we pilot projects? Because we design interventions and the research measurements around the intervention with the kind of, well, often if they're designed by researchers, with the project money. And you're not designing up front a data collection system that's designed to enable you to scale up. So you might actually measure different things if your goal is ultimately to figure out how to scale up a particular intervention into different contexts, into different environments. But we tend not to do that. And I think investing in those measurements right up front in a way in which we build shared measurement platforms can actually be quite valuable. So there's different kinds of shared measurement. The simplest form would be a common platform. It says online, but a common platform for data capture and analysis, including field-specific performance and outcome indicators, so some of the things we've been talking about. You can use a system like that if you engage the participants in that in a comparative performance opportunity. So now you can begin to understand, well, why did it work over here and not over here? And then you can zero in on those places where things are working and really more deeply understand the context in that environment. And it becomes really an adaptive learning opportunity if the participants in those many different sites help to construct not only what the measures are, the ones that are meaningful to them, but also are participating in that kind of ongoing iterative learning. And there are many different benefits from shared measurement, and you can see that as you go towards an adaptive learning opportunity, you're really able to learn in real time, and interruptions or changes in policy or new promotion activities that are happening in that same environment are less disruptive to what you're trying to do if you're doing this in a continuous improvement sort of fashion. What about decision making? Well, it's intuitively obvious if you've got that big, messy, complex system that there isn't one person at the top who can say, this is how it's got to go. You've got to distribute leadership. You've got to distribute decision making and enable those people on the ground with contextual knowledge to be able to make decisions and to act. We need to do that. You need networks and teams so that they can learn from each other. And for teams to work together, you need to build authentic trust. So we have a lot of tacit knowledge in our heads that's hard to codify. And so is it valid evidence? Well, depends on how you think about these things, but certainly on-the-ground experience of practitioners is important to investing in and having interventions work well. And if we don't utilize that tacit knowledge, then we're ignoring a significant component of the evidence that could be valuable to ensuring that when we roll things out and scale them up, that it works well. We need different kinds of networks and teams, and this is just to illustrate there's a range of relationship types that are important. So, things can be as simple as sponsorships, and I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow night with a food industry friend or foe talk. But, sometimes we have relationships between people or organizations where we're relatively independent, where the relationship is mostly transactional. I give somebody money and they go off and do something, or I give them some information and they go off and do it. All the way to true partnerships where we're interconnected, we're co-own the outcome, things like that. This is a partnership organization and you co-own the activities that you're doing. So we have to value all of these kinds of relationships, understand the kind of relationships we're in, and utilize them to build networks and teams. And importantly, we need to build authentic trust in relation, particularly when we have partnerships. Now, trust is actually important because trust reduces complexity. And so let's start with a little bit of language about what do we mean by trust. There's simple trust, devoid of suspicion, demands no reflection. I trust that you guys are going to treat me well when I come here. I'm not going to worry about it. I assume nothing is going to go wrong. And if for some reason something disastrous happened on my trip because Andrew did something that was inappropriate, well, I might not ever regain that trust, right? Because I didn't have to reflect on it. It's simple trust. Authentic trust is where you have to, it's mature, it's articulated, you have to cultivate it. It takes time, you work at it. And if you break it, you can usually recover from it. So I like to build authentic trust with the people who work with me. And I'm thinking about somebody who I said something publicly and was very embarrassed, and I now have to recover the trust that we had built. But I think there was enough authentic trust on the ground to be able to go there. And then there's cordial hypocrisy, which I like to give the language to because we do it all the time. Tomorrow night we'll talk about how it relates to how we engage with the food industry, because we often express this facade of goodwill if we're in the room together, but we don't actually trust each other. And so if we understand this language, it can help us start to try to get to a place where we build authentic trust. And the key here is that trust reduces complexity. Again, intuitively, it's kind of obvious. If I trust Sonia, then I don't have to worry or second guess everything that she may have done to set up my itinerary. I trust it, it's going to work, and I'm not going to worry about it. So it's less complex for me to worry about those things. So when we're in a high trust society, we can form these wide-ranging cooperative partnerships across silos and things like that. And that's not an easy thing to do because the way people in the food industry think, the way people in government think, the way people in academia think, it's different. And you have to learn enough of the other person's job and understand where they come from to build that trust, but then it's a lot easier to work together. And if we live in a low trust society, it can be quite difficult. And as we said, if we want to reduce complexity so that we can operate well, this is a good way to go. So the last three, they're a little bit separate. They don't necessarily hang together, but a few ideas that may be helpful to us as we think about interventions, a little less about the data, but a little bit more about the kinds of interventions that are relevant here. So I like this one because I don't think we think about it very much, the relationship between cooperation and competition. In BC, I live and work in a very competitive environment, which has caused researchers in BC to lose out on big opportunities for money because they competed with each other and they couldn't come together to form a good partnership between this hospital and that hospital. And so in the end, nobody got the money. But if you cooperate, you can float all boats, so to speak. And so the relationship, think about sports teams and sports leagues. They're at two levels in the system. So the league is at the higher level, the team is at the next level down. The most competitive teams in the league, the ones that are the most successful, have the most cooperative players. So cooperation at the team level leads to better and a more competitive environment. And I think we need to think about ways to utilize that idea to incentivize improved cooperation. And I stuck in the little Act Now BC sign because one of the examples where BC did this for, unfortunately, a very short period of time was they engaged ministries in government in a competition for additional funds to their ministry if they cooperated and worked with health, so that if transportation wanted to do another project and it was a project relevant to improving health, they could access new resources. So they created a competition and it led to this cooperation. If you set the right parameters around it, you can use it to actually do really innovative things. And they funded about 30 innovative projects, and then government changed and the money dried up, and so it's a good idea, but we have to stick with it and make it sustainable. Margaret Wheatley talks about the fact that we need to act locally, connect regionally, and learn globally. And this goes back as well to the notion that context matters. So if we do need to act at the local level where that contextual knowledge and that tacit knowledge is, and we do that by forming networks, okay? So within our local environment, there's a local network of players that work together. And networks tend to be formed by self-interested individuals who come together. But as a network starts to grow or build trust and link to other networks and other environments, you start to learn more. So you connect regionally and you take the leaders out of different networks and you bring them together. You start to form communities of practice. So these also tend to be self-organized, but you can nudge them along by helping to bring them together, and then knowledge is shared and exchanged. And ultimately, you can create these systems of influence where people no longer come for self-interest, but they see things can change by working together. So this kind of notion of encouraging or supporting emergence in the direction you want is an important idea that I think we need to think about. And then Trish Greenhalgh talks about the diffusion of innovation, did a beautiful piece of work, very thorough analysis of many different literatures about the diffusion of innovation, and came up with this sort of frame that things run from letting them happen to making them happen. But fundamentally, in a complex system, we need to help things happen. And you can see that the language around those different frames is really quite different. Letting it happen is very emergent, and you may get it's unpredictable, it's not programmed, and something good might happen, but something bad might happen as well. On the other side, making it happen is the notion that you can top-down control and make things happen. So it's programmed, it's managerial, it's scientific and orderly. But fundamentally, in a complex system, you need to help it happen. You need to nudge it along. You need to influence emergence and do those sorts of things. And that's a more negotiated, and you can see where trust, again, becomes important, things like that. So this is my comprehensive list of solutions for complex problems. And I'm just going to close by bringing one other frame to the picture here when we think about complex systems. And that is that we need to think about the levels in a system. So there are multiple levels in a system. We were talking briefly about this on Monday. And those levels range from, at the top of the system, the paradigm, the deeply held beliefs that drive the system. They're very difficult to change, but they can be very powerful if you can change them. All the way through goals, the structure, feedback loops and delays. We rarely think about intervening by creating new feedback loops. In Australia, one of my favorite examples is a group of parents who were offended by the advertising to their children and just created their own little feedback loop to the media. So created a website, vote for the most offensive advertisements to children, and then they took it right to the media. And it caused change in actors pulling out of contracts and things like that, the story that I understand. We rarely actually think about intervening by creating a feedback loop, and I think it can be a very powerful kind of intervention. Where we intervene the most and the kinds of things that we do are in the subsystems, the actors, the operating parameters, those little bits, the fiddly bits down at the bottom. And part of the reason we do that is because that's where the evidence lies. So if we take a group of recommendations, take different documents that recommend actions to address obesity, and if they're built mostly on evidence, and then this is a histogram based on how many recommendations in each of these documents were at each of these levels, most of the recommendations tend to be down at that structural element level because that's where the evidence lies. And so the point of this picture is to suggest we need more data collection, more evidence, more research, if I can use that word, at other levels in the system, or we'll continue to be I'll continue to stand up here and give you some great simple ideas, but we'll never move towards evidence-based solutions that are based on a systems paradigm. And this is really part of the message that I'm trying to give. Now, the last slide just shows that you can take some of those solutions for complex problems and sort them by where they address the system. So at the top, the paradigmatic things that are important is to accept that a problem is complex. Just start there, accept that it's complex and that solutions are different. Move from attribution to adaptation. Move from that reductionism to an integrative approach. Help it happen, not let it or make it happen. Those are kind of deeply held beliefs in a way about how to change a system. Goals need to be functional. We need to support individuals, match capacity and complexity. The structural things we should be thinking about are the things like networks and teams and distributing decision, action, and authority, creating those information flows and building trust to reduce the complexity of the environment. Feedback and delays are things like assessing, we need to assess effectiveness, but also in a different way through shared measurement, through utilizing those relationships between interdependencies, cooperation, and competition. And fundamentally, where we spend most of the time is down at that structural element level. That's the local action that we need to support through those other parts of the system. So those are the ideas, simple ideas, not simple solutions, because if you unpack any of them, you can imagine how difficult it may be to make those changes. But they are relatively simple ideas to convey and recognize that if we accept complexity, there are things that we can do. And I thank you for your attention.